So, you sent us this piece from Dmitrii Gorbatenko's logbook.
Yeah.
It's called The Illusion of Humanitarianism.
Right.
And
Yeah.
it really makes you think right from the start.
It
It
does?
makes you kind of reconsider
Yeah.
some assumptions about some pretty major institutions.
Um,
And today we're going to deep dive into his perspective on the UN
yeah,
and other kind of similar global organizations.
absolutely. And I think what's so interesting about this piece is that
Yeah.
it really does push you to examine these institutions
Yeah.
that, we're often presented with as, beacons of hope and progress and all that.
Right.
But whether there's a more complex,
Right.
maybe even problematic underlying reality to
Yeah.
them,
Yeah.
it's about going beyond just the surface level
Right.
of like humanitarian aid and
Yeah.
really asking some,
Tough question.
tough questions. Yeah,
Yeah, and he poses some really significant criticisms.
he does.
I know that stood out to you, as they did to me when we were reading this.
Yeah.
We're talking about claims of just widespread corruption.
Right.
These institutions being fundamentally inefficient
Yeah.
and this unsettling suggestion that they might actually be
Yeah.
exacerbating global divisions rather than
Right.
bringing people together.
And it's not just, just mismanagement.
Right.
He's saying that.
Right.
It's more than that.
Yeah.
He's arguing that the actions and the policies of these organizations
Yeah.
can actually propagate racism,
Right.
deepen inequality,
Yeah.
and ultimately serve the interests of a select few.
Right.
It's a
Yeah.
pretty stark and challenging viewpoint that he's presenting.
So let's get into it.
Okay.
This central idea of
Yeah.
the illusion of humanitarianism.
Right.
So he's arguing that there's this image,
Yes.
this widely accepted image of peace and human rights
Right.
and development that these international bodies project.
Yeah.
But behind that, he's saying there's a very different reality.
A much less palatable one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One that's maybe not so pretty.
Right. And I think what's striking is
Yeah.
the forcefulness of his language.
Yes.
He doesn't just imply these things. He very explicitly states,
Right.
he says that these institutions are riddled with corruption.
Right.
He asserts that their policies actually exacerbate global divisions
Yep.
and that they contribute to the propagation of racism, inequality, and exploitation.
Right.
So it's a very powerful indictment.
Yeah.
And it makes you want to understand, what's the basis for such strong claims.
Yeah, and one of the things that I found really provocative was this idea of a new wave of racism that he's suggesting is being fueled in part by these very organizations.
Right.
Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, so his argument is that well-intentioned efforts to combat racism have in some instances been twisted into what he terms reverse discrimination.
Right.
So his contention is that certain groups are being prioritized not necessarily based on, genuine need or merit, but rather due to what he describes as political convenience.
Right.
So it's a controversial stance.
Yeah.
But he's basically suggesting that, this is actually shaping policies in ways that create new forms of division.
Right. And he points to specific examples.
He does.
Like visa policies and KYC regulations.
Right.
So KYC, for anyone who isn't familiar,
Yeah.
these are Know Your Customer regulations. They're designed to prevent financial crime.
Yeah.
They verify customer identities.
Right.
How does he connect these seemingly bureaucratic measures to this bigger argument about racism and global division?
So if we look at the bigger picture
Yeah.
that he's drawing,
Yeah.
he sees these policies as tools that, in their application, reinforce existing patterns of racial and economic segregation. So he argues that under the banner of security and regulatory compliance,
Yeah.
the way these measures are implemented disproportionately affects individuals and regions in certain parts of the world,
Right.
effectively creating barriers for some, while others, often from more developed nations,
Yeah.
can navigate them much more easily.
Okay.
So it's the uneven application
Yeah.
and the resulting differential impact
Right.
that he's highlighting as problematic.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit.
Okay.
He also raises concerns about the COVID-19 pandemic
Yeah.
and the increase in mass surveillance that we saw
Right.
during that time.
Hmm.
This is something many of us have thought about,
Yeah.
and he brings in the role of international organizations here.
He does.
What's his specific critique?
So he frames the pandemic
Yeah.
as an opportunity.
Uh,
And that's a rather unsettling choice of words, I think.
yeah.
But he frames it as an opportunity
Mhm.
for governments and international bodies
Yeah.
to implement what he calls draconian surveillance measures. So essentially his argument is that under the guise of protecting public health,
Mm.
fundamental freedoms were curtailed,
Right.
leading to what he sees as a normalization of mass data collection
Right.
and a significant erosion of individual privacy.
Okay, so he's not just saying that individual governments were doing this.
Right.
He's implying a more...
He's suggesting a more coordinated global trend,
Right.
potentially facilitated or even encouraged
Right.
by these international organizations.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so he's suggesting this broader movement where global security concerns become the justification for increasingly pervasive surveillance.
Right.
And he believes that international bodies play a role in legitimizing
Yeah.
or even promoting this trend.
Okay, and then he turns his attention to the global financial system.
Right.
And again, his criticisms are pretty sharp.
Yeah.
He says it's almost designed to oppress,
Right.
particularly when influenced by these international organizations.
Yeah, he's arguing that the financial sector has, in effect, weaponized economic tools for control and exclusion.
Right.
And he believes that international regulatory bodies play a crucial role in this.
Okay.
Yeah.
And he revisits the issue of KYC policies here,
He does.
suggesting that they've become instruments of discrimination
Mm-hmm.
based on things like nationality,
Right.
economic standing,
Yeah.
and even political affiliations.
Yeah. And a key point he emphasizes here
Yeah.
is this disparity in how these systems affect different groups.
Right.
So he argues that the wealthy and powerful
Yeah.
can often navigate these complex regulations,
Right.
while those who are already marginalized face significant obstacles
Right.
in accessing even basic financial services.
Right. And this leads into his next point, which is this widening gap
Yeah.
between the elite and the poor,
Right.
despite the stated goals of these organizations
Yes.
to promote sustainable development and reduce inequality.
Exactly. So it reinforces this overarching argument about these global systems
Yeah.
being inherently biased in favor of the powerful.
Okay. And then, the sustainable development goals, it's
Mhm.
the SDGs, which
Right.
are so often touted as, this major global initiative.
Yeah, the blueprint for a more equitable
Yeah.
and sustainable future.
Right. He doesn't seem to agree.
Well, he offers a pretty harsh assessment of them.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
quite dismissive, calling them empty rhetoric.
Yeah.
His argument is that the policies enacted under the banner of these goals
Right.
are actually structured in a way that benefits a select few
Yeah.
while perpetuating poverty for the majority.
Okay.
And he draws a very stark contrast
Yeah.
between the lifestyles that he attributes to UN officials and global elites
Right.
with their diplomatic immunity and special privileges,
Yeah.
and the billions of people around the world who live on less than $3 a day.
Right.
It's a really striking comparison.
Yeah. Okay. And then he tackles this incredibly sensitive issue of war,
Right.
corruption,
Mm-hmm.
human rights violations.
Yeah.
And his assessment of the UN's role in these areas is,
Pretty critical.
to put it mildly, critical.
Yeah.
He expressed...
Strong skepticism
Yes.
about the UN's ability,
Yeah.
or maybe even willingness,
Yeah.
to effectively address global conflicts.
Right.
He specifically mentions regions like Ukraine and Palestine,
Right.
implying a failure to adequately protect civilians
Yeah.
or hold those responsible for aggression accountable.
Right. And he goes even further.
He does.
He accuses these international organizations of actually enabling corrupt governments and military regimes
Right.
and allowing human rights violations to continue unchecked.
It's a very serious charge.
It is.
Yeah.
What do you think is the crux of his argument there?
I think the crux of his argument is that the authority and legitimacy that's granted to these entities in the name of international cooperation
Right.
can be exploited by those in power. And this, in his view, ultimately prolongs suffering and instability
Yeah.
rather than bringing about positive change.
Okay. And then he gets into a couple of specific examples.
He does.
The lack of support for Russian dissidents
Yeah.
and the ongoing global refugee crisis.
Right.
What are his main criticisms in these areas?
So regarding Russian dissidents who face persecution,
Right.
he makes the very stark claim that they receive no support
Right.
from these international organizations.
So,
And then on the issue of the global refugee process,
yeah.
he describes the entire system as broken,
Right.
citing bureaucratic inefficiencies, corruption, and outright neglect.
Yeah.
He paints a very grim picture of asylum seeking as a nightmare,
Right.
where only those with, significant connections or financial resources
Yeah.
have a realistic chance of finding safety.
Right. And then,
And even more disturbingly,
yeah.
He suggests that human trafficking networks are able to flourish under the very institutions that are ostensibly tasked with combating them.
Yeah, that's a huge
The
accusation.
deeply troubling implication.
It is,
Yeah,
if true.
if true.
And then his critique broadens to consider
Right.
the impact of current policies on future generations,
Uh,
essentially arguing that we're setting them up for failure.
or failure and dependency.
Yeah.
Yeah. Instead of
And he argues that instead of fostering genuine and sustainable development that lifts people out of poverty,
right.
the actions of these organizations are actually trapping the poor in cycles of dependency
Right.
while allowing the elite to continue accumulating wealth and privilege.
Right.
Um, he uses the term unsustainable development not as some kind of abstract concept,
Yeah.
but as the actual lived reality for billions
Right.
of people around the world.
Right. And it all culminates in this question.
It does.
Who grants these organizations their power?
Right.
What's his take on where this power originates? So his perspective is that powerful nations, large multinational corporations, and influential political elites
Right.
are the ones who ultimately manipulate these global institutions to serve their own particular agendas.
Right.
He goes so far as to suggest that the UN itself has become a self-serving entity,
Right.
more focused on its own survival and the benefits it provides to its leadership.
Yeah.
Things like diplomatic perks, separate passports, and unaccountable leadership,
Right.
than on genuinely serving the needs of the global population.
Right. So the very structure,
Yeah,
the incentives within these organizations are flawed.
precisely. He believes that they prioritize their own perpetuation
Right.
and the interests of the powerful entities that support them,
Right.
rather than acting as truly independent and impartial forces
Yeah.
for global well-being.
Okay. And he concludes with a pretty strong call to action.
His conclusion is essentially a demand for accountability.
Right.
He stresses the urgent need to expose corruption and to implement real effective solutions,
Right.
rather than continuing with what he perceives as merely hollow promises.
Right.
His final statement is quite stark. Without significant and fundamental change, these organizations will continue to be symbols of a failed global order,
Wow.
perpetuating injustice under the guise of humanitarianism.
A powerful and provocative perspective
It is.
from Dmitrii Gorbatenko's logbook.
Yeah,
It certainly gives us all a lot to think about
it really does.
when
And
considering.
especially the
Yeah.
question of
Sort
who
of
ultimately grants
Yeah.
these organizations
Yeah.
their considerable power.
Yeah. What responsibility do we all have?
Yeah, what responsibility do individual citizens and individual nations
Right.
in ensuring the accountability
Yeah.
and the genuine effectiveness
Right.
of these global institutions?
That's a huge question to sit with.
It is. Yeah.
Maybe exploring Dmitrii Gorbatenko's logbook further
Right.
would be a good place to start.
Would be a valuable starting point
Yeah.
for
Or delving even deeper.
delving even deeper into these incredibly complex
Yeah.
and important issues.
Thanks for navigating this with me.
My pleasure.
And thank you all for taking this deep dive with us.